Triggered and spent. You ever have one of those weeks? Some people think 2020 is one of those years. I had a failure this week that I'd like to share with you that maybe we could all learn from. I know it's been a week of reflection and meditation for me. And hopefully, the fact that I burned my hand on the stove can save you from doing the same thing. Next on Church Without Walls. I think it was Keanu Reeves who was in a movie where he got in a tussle with a bad guy, and at some point, it was his choice was he's got to kill this bad guy or something bad is going to happen. Something's going to go boom. And the guy had him in a position where he was behind him and he just couldn't get away. And I think he took his revolver and he shot through his own shoulder to shoot the guy. Sometimes life is like that. And sometimes you shoot through yourself to get an adversary, and it's just not that desperate of a situation. It was unnecessary, needless. My mom used to say about regret is that God can heal you. God can pull out the nail, but the hole is still there. So, triggered and spent. What does triggered and spent mean? Some people don't like the word triggered. It's too much like psychobabble for them. But what triggered means, it's a phrase used in cognitive behavioral therapy. And CBT is very similar to a lot of the wisdom shared by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. And so people have seen connections there. And some between CBT and Stoic wisdom and so forth. But cognitive behavioral therapy is a therapy that gets you to train yourself it's preventative medicine. It's a medicine that you practice almost like it's a martial art, right? And so when this opportunity comes in life, you don't have to think about what moves you're going to do. They come natural to you. If somebody is going to hit you with a bat and he's coming this way, you've already practiced that a dozen times in your martial arts, and so it's just muscle memory. And cognitive behavioral therapy is muscle memory for the soul, right? And so if you're looking for a therapist, if you have issues, I highly recommend it. That's kind of where I steer people. But what it does is it looks at moments that you're less than proud of, right? And the moments where you've failed, either where you've spiraled out of control and end up at the bottom of a bottle, or, you look in your rearview mirror and you see a bunch of shattered relationships, this kind of thing. And it does probe a little bit back in time to say, well, what were the steps that got you there? What were the steps that led to this conclusion that we can all agree, that you'd be willing to agree is less than fortunate, right? And so what they teach you is that there's a critical moment where this spins out of control. And that moment is here. And they circle it in the chronology of events that are taking place in your mind. This is where things go sideways. So if we are aware, right, if we have this kind of like, one of those touchless, they take your temperature so you can go to work during the COVID virus. If you have an awareness of when your fever is reaching pitch, you can take a detour so you don't end up, like the crash test dummy, smashed at the end of the wall over and over again. Einstein's definition of lunacy, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. This is how we turn into human crash test dummies, and we don't take a detour. We just drive straight ahead into the brick wall. And at the time, we feel so helpless, like our hands are stuck to the wheel and our foot can't lift off the accelerator. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, or if you feel better about it, New Testament, the New Testament wisdom as taught by the Apostle Paul and others, Peter touched on this, is the power of the mind, right? To be trained to a point where it sees the collision coming. It sees the conclusion before it's too late. And you get to jump off the runaway stagecoach before it goes over the cliff. Yes? So the term triggered means there's a point in this scenario, in this chronology, where it's going to be past the point of no return, right? And there's a trigger that takes you over the cliff. And when you notice the trigger coming, you're going to put on the Kevlar vest, right? So you don't end up spent, triggered and spent, and exhausted and emotionally put through a ringer. I mean, sometimes in your life, don't you feel like somebody stuffed you into a washing machine, and put you on, or dryer and put you on tumble dry, and you get out and you're just emotionally spent, you're exhausted, and then you feel regret and you get so down on yourself and you beat yourself up and you say, I should have known better, I should have seen this coming, why did I do X, Y, and Z, why didn't at V or W didn't I avert the collision by doing this? So a moment like that happened to me this week, and before I get into it, and before we get into a process that can help heal, I want to speak about that word triggered. Oh, and we will check in on Peyton Cam. Ooh, a blank canvas. Oh, and so you've got a canvas and clay working here. This is good. This is good. And it's also good that you hear that your daddy's fallible, right? You've heard it before. Wendy, Peyton said to me this week, Dad, I love you, but I've noticed that a lot of people really don't share that feeling. Spoken like a true PK, even though I'm not a pastor anymore. She's lived 10 years as a pastor's kid, so she's got the scars to show it. But where were we? Triggered. The word triggered. What does the word trigger mean? Well, trigger is something on a firearm that produces a rather significant emotional experience for the person on the other end of the barrel, right? And actually both ends, because there could be a pretty big kickback if it's a .44 caliber, right? Dirty Harry. Triggered is going to enact a set of collisions that ends up in something, in an explosion, right? And at that point, it's like somebody pressed the button and boom, there goes the fuse, and it's going to just be a second till something blows up. Well, if there are things that trigger you in life, it's good to know what they are, right? Like if you're a bull, it might be the color red. It might be the red cape of the guy who's going to stick you with something really pointy in about 5 minutes to the crowd's applause. And if the bull had previous experience, he might say, I'm not going to respond to this red thing anymore. I'm not going to dance to this person's drumbeat. And that would be wise of the bull. And a lot of times life is like that. You're the bull and somebody can press your buttons. And if you know what those buttons are and you see the person walking over to the control panel, you might be able to spare yourself, because you know what? We're not automatons. Right? We don't have to respond when somebody presses that magic button or when somebody triggers an emotional experiences in us. We're Homo sapiens, where we're created in the image of God. We've been given the capacity to overcome that and not be a marionette at the end of somebody else's strings. And yet oftentimes we end up there. Well, what to do both before you get there and after you've gotten there in a wrong manner. That's what I want to talk to you about today. So it is good to know what triggers you. It's good to know what it is that might trigger a response in you. For me, it's easy. For me, it's always been injustice or perceived injustice. If I see an injustice taking place, I've never liked bullies because I was bullied as a very young man. It was a traumatic experience, and my father taught me to overcome it. And then when I overcame it, I went too far the other way, and I thought my job, like my superpower, would be, confronting every bully. And I thought that was my anointing from the spirit in the sky. It's not. But for me, it's always been perceived injustice. And if I see an injustice, or if I see people who are acting cruelly to underprivileged, right? I always, I really didn't like when people would pick on the less fortunate in junior high and high school. Whether it's the kid who's overweight, or the kid with acne, or the kid with eyeglasses, or the just kid who's socially uncomfortable. And that that if you take up the part of those kids, you're going to end up in a lot of conflict, because that's the nature of the jungle in junior high and high school. And I ended up in a lot of conflict. You're seeing some of the conflict today. I got this scar over my eye. People wonder what that's from. That's from that. So to me, I've always been triggered by injustice or apathy toward the less fortunate. And that happened this week, and in social media of all places. And somebody reacted to one of my posts about racial justice, and just the racism was pouring out, so I reacted to that. Now it got to a point, right, point of no return, where I probably went too far. Although some people would look at that and say, "No, you didn't. That person deserved it, or that person earned it." Well, you know what? It's nice to go through life thinking that. That you're God's fly swatter and everyone else is a fly. That's not who Christ calls us to be, though. There's a place that we need to go if we follow Jesus, that brings liberty and freedom and healing, not just to the oppressed, but to the oppressor. And I know this is hard, but the Christian life is hard. A few weeks ago, I botched a quote by Chesterton, and our resident Chesterton expert, Chain Villa, put the quote up. So I appreciate that help from you people in the comments. I love when you fill in the blanks for when my brain freezes. But, Chesterton remarked on the Christian life, and he said, it hasn't been that the Christian life has been tried and found wanting. It's been that the Christian life has been found hard and not tried. So it is hard. It's much easier to live as a Nietzsche follower, as the fly swatter, right? As not turn the other cheek, but pluck. If the idea that was so the motto of the Untouchables. You remember the Untouchables movie about Elliot Ness and the Chicago mob? The idea was, if they send one of ours to the hospital, we send one of theirs to the morgue, right? If they're going to hit you, we're going to kill them, is the idea. This is a kind of a Chicagoism. And a lot of Christians proclaim the name of Christ and follow Jesus and put up great quotes and flowery quotes, but we live like Nietzsche. I'm including myself. We want to be like Jesus. The spirit is willing, but when it comes to it, when the rubber meets the road, we live like Nietzsche. The flesh is weak. And so we're slapped, and instead of turning the other cheek, we hit back. Boom. And then we have two choices. Our choices are to regret that, right? I don't like the word repent. It's just so much baggage with that word. It's people hear it and they think of the church lady. But when a Christian goes through this kind of thing, we have regret. We usually go to prayer. We know we're forgiven, but we might ask for forgiveness or just point out to our Father that we're sorry that we failed and we want to do better the next time. And this is where CBT comes in, and Sermon on the Mount, and many other things, where we say, I don't want to keep doing this. So what do I need to do so that when I get triggered again, it doesn't end up here? I don't end up doing a walk of shame or sitting in a puddle of tears or what have you. And so it's easy to talk like Jesus and live like Nietzsche because we want to hit back, right? When we're wounded. Or what's worse for me is not myself being wounded, but to seeing other people being wounded. So, when it comes to race on my wall, I remember about a month ago, a pastor, this is before the whole George Floyd thing, so it might have been a couple months ago, but a pastor friend on my wall was responding to a racial column I put up, and he said, there's no more racism in the United States. There's no more separated drinking fountains, colored and whites. This is all, a sham. And about 5 or 6 of my African American friends chimed in, and they said, no, I'm a pastor. I live in Wheaton. I drive a pretty nice car. I drive a Lexus. I still get pulled over. When I walk into Men's Warehouse, they still follow me around, when you walk into a store, they still follow you around and look at it. So, and some of my friends who are in mixed interracial marriages commented that they're like, yeah, that's true of us too, when I'm walking down the street with my wife and so forth. So, it's easy for us to pretend that race has been solved in this country if we're white and we don't know anybody who's black. And I hate to say that. I'm not trying to project this on my friend from Ohio. I know he knows and has African American friends. But to actually hear from them, I mean, that's the first step in understanding people, is actually say, wait, and put our political baggage aside, our presuppositions, and, our tribe, and just say, well, what's true in your life? And then listening promotes understanding, which would prevent us from making really foolish statements. And I just remember that happened a couple of months ago, and I thought to myself how much hurt they must have felt to see somebody they respected say things like this, and how much courage it took them to speak up. So again, when this happened this last week, when this woman started spouting like just racist comments, I reacted toward that unseen crowd of my friends who I know are watching this, and so I hit back. And at first, it wasn't a hit. At first, I was just trying to, steer the conversation and maybe point out things to show her where she might be wrong. And I was doing the right thing. I was asking questions. I was kind of giving other examples that maybe she could consider. And it got to a point where I was triggered. And then it was kind of how it gets, on the internet or in social media, with flame war. She throws a bomb, I throw a bomb back, and I reverted to, Sean Connery and the Untouchables. And of course, in our world, we're always the good guys and they're always the bad guys. So she was Robert De Niro and I was Sean Connery or whatever. And so if I had followed my preventive medicine, I would have recognized that, okay, this is getting my temperature up. This is getting to a place where I'm not seeing her as a sister beloved of God, but as, just somebody who's ugly. And I don't know if you follow John Gottman in the Gottman Institute, but he's like the preeminent expert on marriage and relationships in the world, but also in our country. His institute's in the Pacific Northwest. He's written many books about marriage and relationships. And he got to a point where in his study as a therapist, he could tell within 5 minutes by talking to a couple if they'd end up divorced. 5-minute talk. Wow, right? And he lays it out in his book. It's actually very simple. It's actually very simple. And he said there are four things. There are four main things. I'm not going to tell you the four horsemen of the apocalypse, really. That's how you could remember it. That could lead to the death of a marriage, death of a relationship. And he called it the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But I'm going to talk about one. I'm going to talk about the main indicator that he'd see. He could just close his notebook and say, well, thanks. I don't want to take up any more of your time. And that is, it's boiled down to one word, and that word is contempt. Check in on Peyton. Contempt. And he'd be talking to a couple, and he'd realize that it's not a question of, well, this couple fights a lot, and that couple doesn't fight at all. That wasn't a determinant on whether a marriage would last or not, right? Because there are couples who never fought at all the way through the divorce court, right? And then there are couples that fight all the time that you just celebrated their 50th anniversary, and they're pretty still passionately in love, but they fight all the time. And Gottman points out, he said, that's not a determinant, fighting or not fighting, on whether a couple can stay in love and can persevere. It's how you fight or don't fight. And what does he mean by that? It boiled down to one word, and the word was contempt. And in the 5-minute question and answer he'd have with a couple, any couple that would come in, it could be a newlywed couple or a couple of 7 years marriage, he could tell that this is about to end, because he'd ask them, tell me about one of your fights. How did it go? And he'd ask them to discuss how they disagree. And if in explaining their disagreement he recognized contempt between the two, it was over. If you have contempt for somebody, there really isn't room for reconciliation, because you don't see them as another human being with thoughts or feelings of their own. You've just completely isolated yourself in your own world where you're offended, and you've landed in this dangerous area of dichotomous thinking of heroes and villains, where you're the hero and they're the villain, and they must be crushed, they must be destroyed, because ultimately they're evil, right? We're Superman and they're Lex Luthor. And Gottman says when a relationship gets to the contempt level, it's almost unsavable. And so that's the number one value he looks for in a determinant on whether a marriage will be lasting or not. Now, a couple could fight. They could yell at each other and scream and fight and still be madly in love. And that might even be healthy. That might even just be an expression of healthy communication, even, because they're able to share these emotions and yet still not think less of each other. They just, and in the whole wrestling of the thing, things get sorted out, hashed out, as some people would say. And some people who don't fight at all don't fight because one of them might be averse to conflict, but they might already hold each other in contempt, and they don't want to waste their breath. They have already predetermined this isn't going to go anywhere. And so the contempt is actually the silence. Some of you have lived through this. Some of you are living through this. Some of you know this only too well. You've seen it in your friends or in your parents or in your first marriage, right? Contempt is the relationship killer. And you can have contempt for more than just your mate. You can have contempt for somebody who's of another political party just before you even know that person. This is how awful things happen in the world. The Nazi had contempt for the Jew. And the cognitive dissonance there is some of them had personal relationships with Jews, and they had friendly relationships with them, and they just didn't see them as like Jews. And so this is how it plays out, this kind of thinking. And contempt can be more than just between a husband and a wife. It could be between a boss and an employee. It can be with members on the same team or in the same, real estate group or what have you. Whatever relationships we have, contempt can build. And once contempt is established, it's very hard to repair the breach in the wall. People are spent already. They're exhausted. They just don't even want to because they don't think there's any hope there. Contempt is the death of hope. So, if you find yourself, as I did this week, in something that's spiraling worse and worse, and you recognize this feeling, this flush that's coming up, right, from your chest, working your way up to your neck, and it's about to explode out your ears, and worse yet, out your mouth, or at your fingertips at a keyboard. That's when you have to dial it back. My father would always recommend, the prayer. Go right to prayer. Some people recommend walk away from the situation, catch your breath, let a little time pass. Because, you're a pot right now on boil on the stove, and it might be better to take the pot off the stove for a little bit, right? And I know that at some point we don't want to because we're craving justice, and this person is unjust, and they need the hammer, and you're the hammer, and they're the nail. I get it, but, there is a time to talk. I'd like to share a couple quotes with you. I'm not saying don't answer the bully. I'm not saying don't respond to injustice. I think we can do that. And, well, let me share this first quote with you first. And it's something that I've been meditating on this week. I went back to look for it. And this is from the Common Prayer, a liturgy for ordinary radicals. It's a daily reading kind of devotional, and it challenges me, and that's why I love it. And I think you'd find it worth your time, because I don't like just those cards you pick out that make you feel good and then you walk away. I like the ones that actually challenge me, that help mold me, help me grow. And this is, I think, from July 31st. So if you buy the book now, you'll see this again in a month, right? This is from, I think, July 31st. But Common Prayer, Liturgy for Ordinary Radicals. Peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. This is something Martin Luther King believed and taught and acted on. Peacemaking, blessed are the peacemakers. Peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean the absence of conflict. It doesn't mean you avoid conflict. Peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. You're not AWOL from conflict, right? It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. The act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. This is what I mean by the Christian life is hard. This is what's required of us. The act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. This is Abraham Lincoln. When I've made my enemy my friend, haven't I destroyed my enemy? The act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. The act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous, yes, it's hard, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressors free. Peace is about being able to recognize in the face of the oppressed our own faces, and in the hands of the oppressors our own hands. You see, this kind of peace, folks, requires humility. Peace is about being able to recognize in the face of the oppressed our own faces, so we have empathy, and in the hands of the oppressors our own hands, so that we have humility. Well, there's enough there to chew on for a lifetime, let alone a week or 2 weeks or so forth. One of the first things that happens when you fail is you get down on yourself and you beat yourself up. And, guilt is one of those things that tells us something's wrong. And that's okay. It's wrong to stew in it. You got to pick yourself up. You can't beat yourself up. You got to pick yourself up. And then there's things to act on, to make yourself right before God, right? And in the head, and to prepare yourself, preventative medicine, for the next time that this happens. The next time somebody barges into your house and the screen door, as the good colonel tells us, the screen door slams. And we don't want to end up just living in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So every time the screen door scrams, we curl into a fetal position. We don't want to do that. And we don't want to be the one slamming the screen door. So what do? Is there a third way? There is. There is. It's hard. I'll be the first to tell you it's hard. And, you know, one of the first things you learn in hermeneutics as a pastor is never share with your congregation something that's negative about you. Well, now you know why I never practice that as a pastor and why I don't now. As I think part of humility requires us to share with you that we fail too, and sometimes more often or worse than you fail. We're not super saints. We're not at a level of spirituality where we can't fail. We see that in the New Testament. We see that in the Old. We see Abraham failing years into his faith. We see Peter failing. They all fail. We all fail, folks. We all have that. But how do we respond to this failure? Some spiral so far low, like Judas, they end up doing something unspeakable. Some live there for years, and while they don't take their own life, or like Ozzy Osbourne's song "Suicide Solution," sometimes what does he say in that song? Beer is fast, but whiskey's quicker, right? Sometimes we find a quicker way to suicide. Sometimes we take years. And men live in this quiet despair, as they say, that just goes on and on. We never climb out of the hole we've dug for ourselves. Well, we can't do that, right? We have to pick ourselves up because this is normal, and it's typical for us to fail. We fail in different ways. Maybe your vice isn't anger. Maybe you have a different vice, but we all have them, right? We all have these triggers that end up with us in a gutter somewhere, right? But I did want to say one thing before we go too far, and that is that Melissa McEwen says, as my friend Maud once said, there are times when you must speak, not because you are going to change the other person, right? But because there's an audience that may have an open ear. They might never change. They're so dug in. But because if you don't speak, they've changed you, right? And this is the way bullies work sometimes. They live on the fact that 9 out of 10 people are just going to take it. Are just going to shut up and take it. And just let it happen. Now, that's the other negative response, right? To overreact is one thing. To not react is another. These are two places on the continuum that we don't want to park, right? We want to be in the middle of the continuum where we have a just balance. So there are times when you must speak, not because you're going to change the other person, but because if you bite your tongue, if you don't speak, they have already changed you. And if you follow Professor James McGrath of Baylor, no, it's not Baylor, I'm sorry, James, Butler University. It's not Texas, it's Indiana. James has written something similar to the Common Liturgy. He wrote, it takes a profoundly spiritual vision to value and defend the oppressed while never losing sight of the humanity of the oppressor, and never ceasing to make the aim their transformation and redemption rather than their destruction. So you see a ship's captain named John Newton. He's an oppressor. He's not just a ship's captain, he's a slave ship's captain. He's taking slaves, he's bringing them to Great Britain, he's selling them. And for years, people prayed for him, right? He eventually becomes freed of his oppression, of his bondage, and he becomes a liberator himself. So much so, he pens really the world's greatest hymn, Amazing Grace. And he becomes the vicar of a church, and in that church is a young politician named William Wilberforce. And now, under the pastoral leadership of this former oppressor, is born a fire in this man that would lead to the end of the slave trade in England, and really as a domino that follows around the world. This is how God works through people. And God does work through people. I do want to take a few minutes here just to, I was only going to share this with you for a couple minutes, and what I was going to teach you today was this, but now I only have a few minutes for this because we've got to go to Peyton soon. We see nothing on the canvas, but you got something cool going on behind that crayon box. So where was I going to go today? Recently, there has been another high priority or celebrity deconversion, or what some people call deconstruction. A lead singer in another Christian band I never heard of, Hog Nelson. Forgive me, I hate Christian music. Pardon me. So I don't know any of these Christian musicians, but another Christian musician from the band Hog Nelson, John Studingart, is it something like that? Has flown the nest and has left Christianity. And to respond to it, uber apologist from Biola University, Sean McDowell, Josh McDowell's son, wrote a column and then was invited on Justin Brierley's show, Unbelievable, to have a conversation with this former brother in Christ. And so I listened to the conversation, and I love Justin Brierley. He models the Christian balance so well, and he's a great interviewer. So I listened to the conversation between Sean and John. I think it's John. And it turns out that Sean McDowell admitted during that conversation that his column about this guy leaving the faith was his biggest read column and most shared column ever. And then Justin Brierley shares that that episode, later in the week, he shared that episode was like one of the most shared episodes ever. You see, there's an interest in this because there's a lot of young people who are thinking just like this musician who left the faith, and they have the same questions and they have the same doubts. And I think a lot of them are hoping that people like Sean have the answers. And forgive me, I was underwhelmed at the answers. They were typical and predictable, and they're just not working. Those answers aren't working because we haven't stopped to listen yet. We really haven't stopped to listen to our brothers. We're just waiting to reply and waiting to respond. And that's the sense I got out of the interview. You listen to it yourself and tell me what you got. But there's a real interest in these things because people are asking the same questions and they have the same doubts. And what did it for this young man is what did it for Bart Ehrman, who was an evangelical fundamentalist and became kind of a liberal progressive Christian and then left the faith altogether. And he said the reason he left the faith is theodicy, right? The suffering of the innocent in the world. He couldn't posit that there's an all-powerful, all-loving God that allows all the horrible things to happen to children and so forth. And so this singer of Hog Nelson said what really did it for him was a trip to Africa, or he went to some third world underprivileged place in the jungle where like half of the children that are his daughter's age, like Peyton's age, die, right? Or half of them die by the age of 5 of starvation, malnutrition, and their conditions that they're in. And he just can't posit the fact, because he grew up in suburban, America with all this privilege and all this stuff, and an idea of Christianity. He's a pastor's son, that, God answered every prayer, even down to the minutest prayer, like, Lord, I'm late for my meeting, so give me a good parking spot. Now, here's the thing that Sean and other apologists that are trying to talk John out of their deconversion don't realize. He should have left that faith. Don't talk him out of it, applaud it. He's getting closer to the truth, not further away from it, because he believed in a God that would save him a parking spot, but allows a child to starve to death. That God isn't worthy of worship. So why do you keep defending that God? But what I wanted to point out was the difference between, let's say, Samuel Childers, and I'm just pointing this out. See, there's a version of Christianity in fundamentalism and evangelicalism and elsewhere, even in Catholicism, you'll find it. In all the different tribes, they have this virus that thinks that God acts on his own. Like a genie in a bottle, or, like Santa Claus. And if you say the right incantation, or if you behave right, that you'll be showered with blessing and things will happen. Almost like The Secret, Oprah's The Secret, where if you whisper nice things in the universe's ears, the universe will, a spiritual quid pro quo. No. And so here's the thing. Sam Childers and this John's, whatever his name is, this lead singer of Paul Wilson, they both go to a third world country and see want, and they see suffering. And yet they have a different response. And it's because their understanding of God was completely and utterly different. Sam Childers goes to East Africa, and he is going to repair roofs. He's a roofer, right? And so he volunteers to go on this missions trip, and he goes to repair roofs in East Africa, and they're thatch roofs and stuff. And so it's a little different than what he's used to, composition shingle and so forth. But he's fixing these roofs, and at one point he goes to take a smoke break, and it's kind of a dangerous area where there's like a civil war going on. And he walks away from the people out of respect and have a smoke, and he walks into a field and he sees, forgive me, Peyton, you concentrate on this for a second. He sees half the body of a child who had stepped on a landmine, and the bottom half of the child was blown off. He only sees the top half of a child who's like 6 or 7. And he can't tell if it's a boy or a girl. And he's horrified, and his heart is broken. Right? And he doesn't point at God and say, why? Or, you must not be there. But he acts as if God was there. He acts as if God had brought him there to see the need there. And his response to it was, well, what does a Christian do in the face of this kind of horror? Now, 2 viable options. One option is to go home and say, well, there must not be a God. And the other option is to say, God's answer to this is me. So Sam started the Angels of East Africa ministry. He's gone out there. He's built orphanages. He's built wells. He's built schools. He's built businesses to rescue these children and to bring hope to a corner in the world where before this white, and I'm just saying white because of the contrast, this white Christian man shows up in the name of God, and he becomes God's hands and God's feet and God's eyes and God's heart and God's conscience. Where is God in the midst of all that? God works through his children. God works through people. God's answer to the prayer there is for us to respond to the injustice of the world. So, when somebody is pursuing truth, even the atheist, or even somebody who deconverts from the faith, don't talk them out of it. If anything, this lead singer of Hawk Nelson is winding around the mountain, might be closer to the real God for having walked away. A friend of mine said something really profound the last time this happened, I think with Josh Harris. He said, sometimes you have to walk away from Christianity to meet the real Christ. Well, that's both heartbreaking and astoundingly true. It's heartbreaking, but it's astoundingly true. Because we've made a mess of the real Christ. We've dressed him up. We make him speak with our accent, right? We've punished the cultural setting of what he said to so bad that now it becomes a soap commercial or inspiration for us to lose weight instead of a life-changing experience with the risen and glorified Christ. We've reduced Jesus instead of elevated him in many cases. Religion does that. Jesus Christ is revolutionary. And true Christianity isn't always an insurgency. It's always overturning tables of the status quo. And when you become the status quo, understand you're on the wrong side of the cleansing of the temple. So that's what happened to me this week. I mean, we like to think that we'd be, if we were in the temple when Jesus came in and we saw him with the 3-corded whip, we saw him looking around and we saw the anger in his face and the flushing in his face, and we saw him weaving a whip. We'd like to think that we say, hey, Edith, bring me some popcorn. This is going to be great. And yet Jesus walks by the person we think that he's going to overturn their table, and he comes right to our table. And to our horror, he puts his hands on the edge of our table. And now things are acting in slow motion, and he flips that table skyward, and all our coins are flying into the air, and we're at a loss. And until we're humble enough to realize that, yes, Jesus turns over the tables of our soul. And in other words, until we're humble enough to have empathy for the face of the oppressed and realize that humility shows that we bear the hands of the oppressor, we won't grow. We'll be stuck in this kind of thinking, heroes and zeros, then we're always the hero of our own story. We'll never, and then when we do fail and we realize that we're not so much of a hero, we might not have the strength and the courage to get up out of the hole and to dust ourselves off and to say, sister, I still think you're wrong. I still think your view is wrong, but you're not wrong. And I love you. So there's some point in social media where, and I'm going to try and stick to this rule, and I broke it, but in social media, things get carried away, and sometimes let's check in on Peyton. And in social media, we have this tendency to react on the spot, and yet we need to recognize a trigger. And here's a trigger. If after 2 answers where you've gone back and forth with somebody in extreme disagreement, it keeps going, maybe that's the time to say, I love you, and I value your opinion, but I think it would be more appropriate if we do this in private. Can I take this to an instant message? And just refuse to have the food fight in public. And I know there's a fine line, because there is that audience. There is the audience watching, and sometimes you're doing it for the benefit of the audience. But if you feel yourself losing control, then what's more important is, in other words, if you feel yourself feeling contempt for the person you're confronting, then you have to push away from the table and say, let's take this up inside. Let's let's go into my office and talk about it. And, maybe if we can come to some sort of agreement, we'll bring it back into the public. That's hard to do. It's hard to do when you just talk like Jesus, but you live like Nietzsche. Maybe that'll be the title of my show today. Pei, are you almost ready, or do you need me to fill for a few more minutes?
Almost. Just give me a minute.
Give you a minute? Okay. Well, listen, at this point, folks, I guess I will tell you, I've shared with you my kind of failure this week. Let me share with you some of the good things that are happening with the Sparrow's Call. We've been hearing from more and more people. Some of the reactions are sad. People going through doubt, and even people who consider themselves outside the faith right now. And yet people seem very appreciative that they have a corner of the Christian universe where they can come, let their hair down, and tell what they're feeling without being judged. And so we're getting a good response along those lines. We're also talking to some great people who can help along the way. I'm going to share with you a few of those talks now. Later this evening, the full interview with Dennis Venema, who's a biologist who teaches up at a university in Canada, Trinity Western University. He's a PhD from the University of British Columbia. He's written for the BioLogos Foundation. But in our Voices in the Wilderness series with my co-host, Christine Johnson, we've been interviewing some fascinating people. One of those interviews was with Dennis, and it's called Reconcilable Differences, Evolution and Creation. So he's an evolutionary biologist, and he's also a devout Christian, and he talks about how sometimes Christians can, and their science denial gets in the way of their faith. So we have Dennis later today. We've already released the full interview with Keith Giles, who has a similar story to mine. He was in the pulpit for many years and then left the pulpit to start a house church and to have a ministry towards those going through deconstruction. So his interview is called, Though the Heavens Fall, Surviving Deconstruction. And that interview is also available right now at sparrowscall.org or our YouTube channel. If you haven't already liked their channel, I don't know, press the bell and like it. And then whenever we have a new video, whenever we have a new video, you'll be one of the first to know it. It'll be coming out. And so, why? Oh, I see why. So, we have that coming out later today. And later today, we are talking to a philosopher, a professor in philosophy, who's going to be talking about dichotomous thinking. Dichotomous thinking is this black and white thinking that creates versions in our head that there's only heroes and zeros. And so if you're not with us, you're against us. And if you're against us, you're damnable evil that must be crushed and destroyed and exposed. And it's this kind of thinking that we see pervasive in America right now, especially in 2020. The arguments over wearing a face mask, something a little of that, the science denial going on in Christianity about the coronavirus and government trying to take control, and all these arguments people are having to do over the virus and over racism and over how to understand the Bible or what a real Christian is. And you see all this going on, and it's so ugly, and it's so, in many cases, so unnecessary. And you say, why? Why is this happening? And at the root of it all is dichotomous thinking, is black and white thinking, because ultimately that lacks empathy and humility, if you're thinking along those lines. And it's ultimately a thing of pride, because we always write our own story with us as the hero. That's just the psychological, built-in, wired thing. We are always the hero of our own story. And that could be incredibly dangerous, to see yourself always with the cape, right?
Okay, Daddy, I think I'm done.
You think you're done? Mm-hmm. Okay. Show us what you got.
Today, I made a doll. She has short hair like mine, and she's wearing a pink dress with a orange waistband and 3 blue dots, polka dots.
Beautiful.
And I made her blue shoes.
And what's behind her?
This is just a background so you could see her.
Oh,
Because her skin.
are these just extra pieces of clay there?
Yeah, I think I'll use them next time I make clay. I'll put them in
Okay.
a plastic bag.
Does your doll have a name?
I didn't name her yet.
Can you hold her up to the camera? Maybe people will come up with a name in the comments section. I like that she has a smile, Poe.
Mm-hmm.
And her belt has 3 buttons on it. Is that a dress?
Yeah.
Very pretty. Very pretty. All right, well, folks, for John and Peyton and Church Without Walls, may you have a blessed week. We'll see you next week.